Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. You can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 144 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, and today's episode is on why do people emotionally abuse each other. So this is a really interesting podcast episode about emotional abuse and actually why people want to do it, because when we think about it, it's such an unthinkable, horrible thing to do, but people still do it. So why? This is a great podcast episode that I really enjoyed researching, and that you should enjoy it too. And it is Saturday the 9th of April 2022 as I record this. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're going to be reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. The first one is, here are the personality traits of the self-made millionaire. Open quote. Let me tell you about the very rich. Close a quote. Wrote F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Rich Boy. Open quote. They are different from you and me. Close a quote. Fitzgerald's narrator was referring to the way wealth can shape people's character, but a new study suggests that people with particular personalities may also be more likely to become wealthier in the first place. Writing in Humanities and Social Sciences Communications, the team finds that millionaires have a unique pattern of personality traits compared to the rest of us, and this is especially true for millionaires who made their wealth on their own. So I'm actually just going to click on the article that but it was actually quite interesting, because it turned out that the self-made millionaires actually tended to be more risk tolerant, and they were more open to experiences, they were more extroverted, and they actually had higher levels of conscientiousness, but they were less neurotic. So from a personality psychology perspective, this is actually quite interesting, and it does actually tell us a bit about this group of people though, because they're more likely to take risks, and they're more willing to actually try and experience new things. And because they're more extroversion, they're more willing to actually go after those opportunities through talking and actually interacting with people. So very, very interesting. And I think there's a lot that all of us can actually take away from that. For example, maybe we should all be a bit more open to new experiences, try to be a bit more extroverted, despite how hard that might be, and definitely try to be less neurotic. And if you wanted to learn more about personality psychology and individual differences, then please check out my book with the same title, available in all the usual places. So the second one is, people who grew up in cities tend to be worse navigators. The environment in which you grew up can have a long-lasting effect on your navigation skills, according to an analysis of the data from nearly 400,000 players on a mobile game. People who spent their childhood in rural or suburban areas tended to be far better at navigating in the game Sea Hero Quest than those who grew up in cities. This difference could be seen decades later, the researchers report in Nature, and it was particularly striking in countries where cities are in their grid layouts. And I can actually understand this, because in rural settings, I don't know if you have been in there, but the British rural settings, how can I put this delicately? It's so badly signposted, and it is honestly just not the best navigation, and it's just so hard to get from one area to another, without a map. So you really, really do need to be quite good at navigation. Thankfully, I've never lived in a rural area, and I've only visited or been there for a few days, and no, I would not want to live there. Yeah, so there's definitely that though. And yes, I don't live in a city area, but I would say I live in a more suburban area. Yeah, area though, but the good thing about cities though is, of course, you've got tons of maps, everything everything is signposted, so all you need to do is that you would just need to follow signposts, and you don't necessarily need to do any more navigation than that. So very interesting. And the last one is, what leads people to believe that they have been abducted by aliens? And this is something that I've actually been wanting to cover for quite a while, and I think for Halloween I'm going to try and do some paranormal psychology episodes, because that's another area of psychology that we've never looked at. Alien abduction stories are, at least in the West, relatively common, From as far back as the early 60s, there have been reports of people being stolen away by aliens, typically at night, often for various physics-defining experiments, before being returned home in one piece. And while stories like these might strike some as delusions that would typically arise from certain mental health issues, studies have found that abductees are no more likely than anyone else to have conditions affecting their perception of reality. Thanks to psychological research over the past few decades, however, we can probably conclude that these aliens' misadventures arrive due to two entirely more mundane phenomena: sleep phasia and false memories. And it's actually the whole sleep paralysis. So yeah, everyone, I slightly missed to say read that. So sleep paralysis and false memories, and it's actually the whole sleep paralysis that really kicks off the whole process. So because sleep paralysis is that when you're lying in a bed, but then you can't move. So you are basically awake, but you cannot move. And what's actually really normal in these sort of situations is that the people tend to experience very specific sets of hallucinations. For example, buzzing and flashing lights. So, which if you've ever looked in at alien abduction stories, which I haven't, I've just heard them, is that they're always the really common threads. And those flashing lights and the buzzing are two of the commonalities. And it's actually quite interesting to see how these different phenomena can actually warp our perception at such, I'm going to say extreme degrees, that people actually believe that they've been abducted by aliens. So that's enough for psychology news section, so let's move on to the personal update. So moving on to the personal update, this week has been a rather busy one, and actually quite a strange one, because two main things have actually happened. So earlier in the week, I went up to London for London Book Fair, which is a major international publishing conference. So that was actually quite interesting to actually get to talk to other authors and to actually see where the industry was actually going there. And I'm not actually going to talk about it too much, simply because there's nothing relevant for all of you wonderful people. But the only thing that I will say about it is that because for 2 solid days I was surrounded by noise, constant noise, so many people, yes, and also train noises. First day it was actually so weird to actually get back to a quiet house and actually have relative silence. That that really did take me quite a while to get used to. But on the new relative psychology front, I've actually started to write up the literature for my psychology placement. So I've done the introduction. And people who who would do this for living and masters and PhD students, I'm really impressed because I really do not think I would want to do it for living there. Yeah, simply because it does take you quite a while, but find the right words, find the research, write it up in a good enough structure, and also try to say stuff as concisely as possible. But I am enjoying it, and I definitely know that because of this placement, my academic writing is improving. And I know that going into my final year, this placement would have really helped me and given me a lot of skills. So if you're thinking of doing a psychology placement, then definitely do it, because it will really help you. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment in the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And the sponsored product for today's episode is Abnormal Psychology, the Causes and Treatments of Depression, Anxiety and More, a 3rd edition. So this is an absolute brilliant book which will really help you get a much deeper understanding of how depression works. So it looks at the biological, social and the cognitive causes of depression, and also looks at anxiety, schizophrenia, and so many more great conditions that are really interesting. Interesting them. So I cannot recommend this great, really easy to understand book enough. So if you wanted that is Abnormal Psychology, the Causes and Treatments of Depression, available from all major ebook retailers, paperback and the hardback version from Amazon at your local bookstore and local library if you request it. But if you didn't want to buy a book, but you're still willing to give the podcast a bit of one-time support, then you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ConnorWhiteley. So let's get on with the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode, So we're going to be talking about why do people emotionally abuse others. And with psychology being the scientific study of our behaviour, it only makes sense that we want to understand people who abuse each other. So that's going to be the focus of today's episode. But before we talk about why do people do it, we actually need to talk about what is emotional abuse. Because as I said, emotional abuse, and to be honest, any sort of abuse, is one of those things that people talk about, but we don't really have a firm understanding of what it actually involves. Because until this episode, I knew what emotional abuse was, but if you ask me how to define it, well, I wouldn't be able to give you a very firm definition. Therefore, just so everyone is on the same page, emotional abuse is when people use their behaviours and the words to frighten someone and / or cause them emotional distress or pain, leading to the victim to develop a siege mentality over time that makes it difficult for them to trust others and to form close relationships. How does emotional abuse manifest itself? So, but there are 4 ways that emotional abuse reveals itself, which are verbal abuse, where the abuser uses words or other vocalizations to hurt you emotionally or frighten you, as well as this includes yelling, threatening, name-calling, and intimidation. Social isolation, where the abuser prevents you from socializing with others, and this makes you feel lonely and depressed. Passive aggression. With these types of abuse is using indirect methods to communicate their negative attitudes towards you. For instance, if you were meant to be going out with a friend for dinner and you forgot, and then the friend calls you, reminds you, and you rush out the door to get to the restaurant, naturally you would apologise, but your friend might say they're okay with it, but act all quiet and grumpy for the rest of the evening. Gaslighting. Now, I've seen a lot of the content on this area recently and over the past few months, and I do actually want to do some podcast episodes on it in the future. But gaslighting just seems like a word that I was meant to know. But now, while we can all thankfully find out what it is. Gaslighting is a covert type of abuse that denies what the victim feels that they know with a certainty, leading them to question their senses, sanities, and judgment. For example, your partner throws away a book that they know that you were going to read and love that, but then they deny that they ever saw it, hence making you question whether you were imagining things or not. Another example is your partner cracks your phone screen when you aren't looking, and then they insist that they saw you drop it on the floor, again making you question are you forgetting things or not. And personally, this is absolutely disgusting, and I'm honestly shocked that people actually do this, because it does sound so horrific. It sounds like something that you would just never imagine doing to another person. I just do not know why people would do it, because this is so evil. It's absolutely evil. And when I was actually writing that bit of the blog post, I was actually speechless, because why would you make someone feel like that? Yeah, to be honest, I think I'm going to have to do some podcast episodes on it in the future. Okay, so why do people emotionally abuse others? So there are 5 reasons, which we're going to look at now. An abuser gets off on controlling others or seeing people suffer. Whilst this is not surprising, it is still good in a way to have the research confirm that the feeling of control and being powerful can give someone immense pleasure. Therefore, these people abuse others because they enjoy the feeling of controlling others and watching them suffer too. This is why, according to Bogoroff 2020, psychopaths, sadists, and narcissists might be drawn to emotional abuse because the pleasure these types of people will take in having power over others and seeing them suffer. Revenge. As with most revenge-related behaviours, it is very interesting because it's extremely subjective. For example, you might not believe that you did anything wrong, and sometimes that will be true. In these cases, it is about a person perceiving you wronging them, so they are going to get revenge. Whatever the case, if someone wants revenge against you, emotional abuse can get a very attractive option because it can do a lot of damage, as well as the legal system isn't really set up to handle emotional abuse. And of course, that only applies if that's a barrier for them, which of course in most cases that actually isn't. However, unlike sadists, abusers who are seeking revenge don't necessarily take a pleasure from seeing others in pain per se, since their pleasure comes from their own retribution and the act of getting revenge itself. Abusers stand to gain from incapacitating you. Now, this is a really interesting motive because sometimes abusers emotionally abuse others because there are major benefits from having you incapacitated, since frequent emotional abuse leads to impaired ability to function and it causes mental distress, leading people to lack the drive, energy, and sexual clarity of mind to fulfill normal duties. And in some of the most extreme cases, sometimes the victim agrees with the abuser that the best place for them is a mental hospital. And of course, this has been done in books, TV, and films so many times, but this is absolutely horrific and horrifying because this motive can actually work so well that evil or bad people can effectively use it to get custody of a children, a job promotion, or to get you fired and get access to all of your money. That I honestly think is just terrifying. Wants to rise in the ranks. And this leads on from the last point. Since some rather awful people use emotional abuse to rise up in the ranks of an organisation. They do this by emotionally abusing others in the workplace by bullying them, as well as this abuse can be designed in such a way that tilts the balance of power in their direction between their colleagues because they're envious of their victim's success, or they want the promotion that the victim is likely to get. Therefore, by bullying and abusing others, the abuser can gain power over the victim. That makes the abuser induce fear or distress in the victim, meaning that the abuser can exploit that power to make themselves look successful, whilst the victim looks nothing more like an absolute failure. And I really hope this never happens to me or anyone else. Attention and sympathy. And now this is the reason I definitely never would have thought of by myself. But some abusers use emotional abuse to make people give them affirmation, sympathy, and attention. Since this is what makes a martyr tick, because some people decide to play a martyr to engage in self-sacrifice in order to solicit affirmation, sympathy, and evoke guilt in other people. For example, if your brother is moving into a new home with his partner and you offer to help him, but he declined, then he would do all of the moving himself in an act of self-sacrifice and expect you to feel sorry for him afterwards. Yet if you don't feel sorry, he would start to guilt trip you, and that's the bit of emotional abuse. And it's also in portions though, where even though that example that one off might not seem like emotional abuse, sort of people don't just stop at one example because they tend to do it multiple times. It took me about times though. There are plenty of other reasons why people abuse others, both emotionally and physically, and it does make for interesting reading. But I think that we can all agree that this is awful, unneeded, and people shouldn't do it in the slightest because of the amount of damage that it can do for a person. So please, my unofficial tip would be, if you think you're being emotionally abused, be aware of it and try to deal with it. Maybe cut that friend or family member out of your life. Report the abuser to your bosses or your boss's boss, if your boss is the abuser, or do something else entirely. There is no place for emotional abuse in the world. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and that you got something out of it. I really did, and I really do like exploring this the darker form of psychology and human behaviour. If you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help me spread the word about the podcast. And to definitely check out Normal Psychology, the Causes and Treatments of Depression, Anxiety and More, 3rd edition. It's a great book that I cannot recommend enough. And if you liked today's episode but you didn't want to buy a book, then please check out buymeacoffee.com/Con Whiteley. So have a great day everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to conwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to conwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.